Room for one more, honey.
What's up, everyone? Our Twilight Zone marathon of reviews continues. Today, we'll be checking out one of the more chilling episodes, 22. This was episode 17 from the second season. 22 was directed by Jack Smite, and it's a spooky story adapted by Rod Serling from a 1944 short anecdote by Bennett Cerf. As Bennett Cerf himself stated, it's an age-old horror tale with an origin that's unknown. We'll speak on that a bit later. Before we begin, I may as well bring up the elephant in the room. In this day and age of 4K, this episode stands out. 22 was one of 6 episodes that was shot on videotape, as opposed to film. Why was 6 episodes shot on video, you ask? CBS was hoping to cut costs, however, the format was still in its early days, the savings weren't as much as they'd hoped for, and the soap opera look really wasn't something that worked for the Twilight Zone. Thankfully, after 6 episodes, they just returned to shooting on film. Let's get to it. As always, spoilers are ahead.
This is Miss Liz Powell. She's a professional dancer. She's in the hospital as a result of overwork and nervous fatigue. And at this moment, we have just finished walking with her in a nightmare. In a moment, she'll wake up and will remain at her side. The problem here is that both Miss Powell and you will reach a point where it might be difficult to decide which is reality and which is nightmare. A problem uncommon, perhaps, but rather peculiar to the Twilight Zone.
Our episode opened on a terrifying note. Liz Powell, as played by Barbara Nichols, is suffering from a recurring nightmare. In her dream, she's awakened by the ticking of a clock. She knocks over a water, and a glass breaks. From there, she follows the sound of footsteps. The footsteps belong to a nurse. She's compelled to follow the nurse down to the basement, to the hospital morgue. The nurse then shocks Liz by stating,
Room for one more, honey.
It's easy to relate to Liz. We've all had confusing nightmares and maybe even recurrent dreams. But Liz's case is unusual. She's convinced that her nightmares are real. Everyone around her thinks she's losing her mind. And that includes her agent Barney.
What a mind you got. What a mind.
That's what bugs you, isn't it, Barney? My mind. You think I left it in a bus station someplace, don't you?
Now keep in mind, Liz is in the hospital for being overstressed and overworked. But here's Barney, bringing her a photo of herself at work to remind her of work. So, aside from serving as a means to provide us with a bit of Liz's backstory, Barney could also be one of the sources of stress in Liz's life. We also meet another supporting character, the Doctor, as played by Jonathan Harris, and he's another questionable player. Whenever he speaks, it's like he's channeling Vincent Price.
You wake up, you feel thirsty, you reach for the glass, you hear the clock ticking loudly.
One more shady ingredient added into the mix is the fact that the Doctor is pretty flirtatious with Liz as well.
You make an old doctor wish he were a young intern.
Ultimately, Liz's spooky hornball doctor tries to persuade her that her dreams are not real. He introduces her to the night nurse who works in the morgue, and of course the woman isn't the same person from Liz's dream. Liz remains unconvinced, so the doctor suggests that the next time she finds herself in her recurring dream, she experiment by breaking the pattern within the dream. A solid idea. That night, the dream begins as always, but this time, Liz does her best to flip the script. Instead of reaching for the water, she makes a conscious effort to reach for a cigarette. However, she drops a lighter, and when she reaches for it, she accidentally knocks the glass on the floor. So here we go again. The nightmare is triggered, and Liz is forced through the same chain of events.
Room for one more, honey.
Once the nightmare concludes, Liz is so frantic, she has to be restrained for a sedative. Soon after, while reviewing her case, the doctor notices a detail that is unexplainable.
Now that's really odd.
What is, Doctor?
This afternoon when I was talking to her and she was telling me about this dream, going down to the morgue.
Morgue?
Yes. She's never been there before.
Patients are allowed there.
And yet when she tells me the story, she mentions room 22.
Room 22? Well, if she'd never been there, how would she know?
How would she?
Although we as viewers know something still isn't quite right, Liz is discharged from the hospital. She heads to the airport to catch her flight to Miami. And what's her flight number? You guessed it, Flight 22. With that, Liz begins experiencing a variation of the details from her recurring dream. She's distracted by the loud ticking of a clock, she bumps into a woman carrying a vase, which crashes to the floor and breaks, and by this point she's utterly terrified. And then it happens. Just as she's about to board her plane, she's greeted by the flight attendant.
Room for one more, honey.
With that, Liz flies back down the stairs and heads back to the terminal, and I don't blame her. As the airport staff tries to calm her down, Flight 22 takes off and explodes while in flight.
Miss Elizabeth Powell, professional dancer. Hospital diagnosis, acute anxiety brought on by overwork and fatigue. Prognosis, with rest and care, she'll probably recover. But the cure to some nightmares is not to be found in known medical journals. You look for it under potions for bad dreams, to be found in the Twilight Zone.
I mentioned earlier that Rod Serling adapted this tale from Bennett Cerf's 1944 short anecdote. However, that tale itself was adapted from a 1906 short story by E.F. Benson called The Bus Conductor. There's also another take on this story in a highly regarded 1945 British anthology horror film, Dead of Night, which you'll recall I mentioned in my review for The Dummy.
Just room for one inside, sir.
Now, in all of these versions, there are differences in gender and the setting. One common element in all the versions of this story is an individual haunted by a mysterious or frightening figure, and they each allude to a premonition, their own looming death, which is narrowly avoided. 22 may be a tale that's been told before, but the iteration we got from Rod Serling was certainly unique enough and fitting as a Twilight Zone entry. That said, let's take a look at two major factors that played into this unnerving story. The first big factor in 22 is Liz's recurring dreams. These types of dreams can be brought on for many reasons. Unresolved conflicts, or stress in a dreamer's life. They can even be tied to medication or substance abuse. Now in Liz's case, all we really know is she's a dancer who's been hospitalized for overwork and nervous fatigue. And one other thing we know is her accent sounds very familiar.
What's it going to be tonight? Big discussion about Freud and dreams?
Talk about grasping at straws!
Speaking of New York accents, take it from someone who knows. This episode is authentic. Barbara Nichols was raised in Queens. Jonathan Harris and Arlene Sachs were both born in the Bronx, my home turf. So this episode is basically like a family reunion. Anyway, the second major factor at play is the revelation that Liz's nightmares were actually a premonition. Liz's death is imminent. The ominous phrase, room for one more, basically served as a warning. Luckily, Liz was able to foresee her own demise. Sure, her warning came in the form of nightmares, but ultimately the message within those dreams saved her life. If Liz hadn't been shocked into fleeing away from Flight 22, she would have been killed. 22 is certainly one of the more grim Twilight Zones. The dreary hospital setting with a staff of questionable people definitely heightened the horror. There's a relentless sense of impending doom. The ominous tone and the feeling that death was stalking Liz was prevalent throughout. The usage of dreams worked just as well here as it did in two other classic Twilight Zone episodes, both written by Charles Beaumont, Perchance the Dream, and the second season episode, Shadow Play. On that note, anyone who's a fan of the Final Destination series might enjoy this particular Twilight Zone. The original Final Destination featured a teenager who has a premonition that his plane will explode upon takeoff, killing everyone on board. Although he cheats death when he misses the flight, death continues to haunt the teenager. Going by Rod Serling's closing narration for 22, he stated that with rest and care, Liz would probably recover, so thankfully death won't continue to stalk Liz. She seems to have cheated the Grim Reaper, at least for the time being. In terms of performances, Barbara Nichols did pretty well here. The strength of her performance for me was mostly evident in her terrified reactions. I have to credit her, she's basically an OG Scream Queen. Interestingly, Nichols was actually seen as a bit of a rival to Marilyn Monroe in her early days. So I guess it's appropriate that Nichols also appeared on the original 60s Batman show as a character named Maid Marilyn.
Excuse me, miss. Have you seen 3 men on horseback riding in this neighborhood?
3 men on a horse in downtown Gotham City, Batman? I think you've been working too hard.
And then there's Jonathan Harris, an odd highlight in this episode. He's a bit of a red herring, and you're never really sure what his deal is.
Room for one more, honey.
Jonathan Harris actually had a career which spanned decades. He's best known as Dr. Smith in the 60s sci-fi series Lost in Space. But he also made his mark in voice acting for animated movies such as Bug's Life and Toy Story 2. He also did voice work for animated TV shows such as Spider-Man the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series, just to name a few. I have to mention Arlene Sachs as the nurse. Although she too had very little screen time, she was very menacing. She reminded me a bit of Maya the Catgirl from Perchance the Dream. Both had a dark, uncanny quality, fitting for stories that featured nightmares. So there we have it. 22. Another solid episode, though probably not top tier for me. It's still memorable in its own right. I do wish it had been shot on film. I've noticed most fans of the series are either indifferent toward the episodes which were shot on videotape, or some even feel the videotape quality helped by adding a surreal atmosphere. For me, I prefer film all the way. I would never take away points on that basis. I can still appreciate the story for what it is no matter what. My only gripe with the episode was that we ran through Liz's dream twice, and the doctor even recounted the dream at one point. But the repetition didn't slow the pace enough for me. Overall, this was still a creepy, chilling, somewhat different Twilight Zone, and it's definitely another one for fans of psychological horror. I'd rate it 3 out of 5 creepy nurses. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've seen 22, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this review, remember, hit that sub button, hit that like button. The road to 1,000 subs begins here. Any help is totally appreciated. Until next time, be well, take care, later.